line. C.S. Lewis wrote, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable." Today's stories and poems, as you may have guessed, is about love, the chances we take with it. In the first poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, he reminds us that romantic love is for all humans of all ages. And we're reminded that love can appear in almost any time or place. Here is Invitation to Love. Come when the nights are bright with stars, or when the moon is mellow. Come when the sun his golden bars drop on the hayfield yellow. Come in the twilight soft and gray, come in the night or come in the day. Come, O love, whene'er you may, and you are welcome, welcome. You are sweet, O love, dear love, you are soft as the nesting dove. Come to my heart and bring it rest as the bird flies home to its welcome nest. Come when my heart is full of grief, or when my heart is merry. Come with the falling of the leaf, or with the reddening cherry. Come when the year's first blossom blows. Come when the summer gleams and glows. Come with the winter's drifting snows. And you are welcome, welcome. My first story today is a story of love that pertains to second chances. Here, we meet two older individuals, Gustav and Grace. They are accomplished, passionate individuals who find themselves deeply and quickly attracted to one another. They act on their attraction and marry, but soon realize that they are very different people. How will this marriage turn out? Here is the short story, Elder Jinx, written by Edith Perlman and published in The New Yorker. Grace and Gustav were married in August in Gustav's home, a squat, brown shingled house whose deep front porch darkened the downstairs rooms. The house lot had ample space for a side garden, but there were only rhododendrons and azaleas hugging the building, and a single apple tree stranded in the middle of the lawn. Every May, Gustav dragged lawn chairs from the garage to the apple tree and placed them side by side. When Grace had first seen this array in July, she was reminded of a nursing home, although she wouldn't say anything so hurtful to Gustav, a man easily bruised. When you could tell from the way he flushed when he took a wrong turn, say, or forgot a proper name. So she simply crossed the yard and moved one of the chairs so that it angled against another, and then adjusted the angle. Oh, they're snuggling now. The third chair she overturned. Gustave later righted it. They had met in June, in front of a pair of foxes who made their own reluctant home at Bosky's Wild Animal Preserve on Cape Cod. Gustave was visiting his sister in her rented cottage, and Grace had driven in from western Massachusetts with her pal, Henrietta. The two women were camping in the state park. "You're living in a tent?" Gustave inquired on that fateful afternoon. "You look as fresh as a flower." "Which flower?" Grace was a passionate amateur gardener, as well as a passionate amateur actress and cook and hostess. Had she ever practiced a profession? Yes, long ago she'd been a second-grade teacher until her own children came along to claim her attention. "Which flower?" "A hydrangea," Gustave answered. Surrounded by his own exhilaration, he goes, "Your eyes." Further surprised, this time noticing his rising desire. Her tilted eyes were indeed a violet blue. Her skin was only slightly lined. Her gray hair was clasped by a hinged comb that didn't completely contain its abundance. Her figure was not firm, but what could you expect? "I'm Grace," she said. "I'm Gustave," he said. He took an impulsive breath. "I'd like to get to know you." She smiled. "And I you." Grace was employing a rhetorical locution popular in her Northampton crowd. Eclipsis, the omission of words easily supplied. Gustave, after a pause, silently supplied them. Then he bowed. His late mother was Paris-born. He honored her Gaelic manners, even though, except for 5 years teaching in a Rouen lycée, he had lived his entire life in the wedge of Boston called Godolphin. Grace hoped that this small man, bending like a head waiter, would now brush her fingers with his mustache. But no. Instead, he informed her that he was a professor. His subject was the history of science. Her eyes widened, a practice maneuver, though also sincere. Back in Northampton, her friends, and there were scores of them, included weavers, therapists, advocates of holistic medicine, singers, and of course professors. But the history of science, the fact that science even had a history, somehow it had escaped her notice. Copernicus? Oh, yeah, Newton and Einstein, yes, and Watson, and what's his name? Crick? She triumphantly produced, cocking her head in a flirtatious way. "Is your neck bothering you?" That Hal Karsh had hinted was no longer becoming. She straightened her head and shook hands like a lady. Gustave had written a biography of Michael Faraday, a famous scientist in the 19th century, though unknown to Grace. When he talked about this uneducated bookbinder inspired by his own intuition, Gustave's slight pomposity melted into affection. When he mentioned his dead wife, he displayed a thinner affection. But he had apparently been a widower a long time. In Northampton, Grace volunteered at a shelter, tending children who only irregularly went to school. Neglected kids, all but abandoned by their mothers, she said, mothers themselves abandoned by the kids' fathers. Gustave winced. when she went on to describe the necessity of getting onto the floor with these youngsters, instructor and pupils both cross-legged on scabby linoleum, Gustave watched her playfulness deepen into sympathy. She constructed an indoor window box high up in the makeshift basement schoolroom. She taught the life cycle of the daffodil, its biography, so to speak, including some falsities that Gustave gently pointed out. Grace nodded in gratitude. I never actually studied botany in my university, she confessed. The University of Wichita, she specified. But later she would mention the University of Wyoming. But perhaps he had misheard one or the other. He'd always been vague about the West. A lawyer friend of Gustave's performed the wedding ceremony in the dark living room. Afterward, Grace sipped champagne under the apple tree with Gustave's sister. Oh, Grace, how peaceable you look. You'll glide above his little tantrums. What? Grace said, trying to turn toward her new sister-in-law, but unable to move her head on her shoulders. A Godolphin hairdresser had advised the severe French twist that was pulling cruelly at her nape. Henrietta had urged the white tulle sombrero. Grace herself had selected the dress, hydrangea blue, and only one size too small. Her grandchildren, who with their parents had taken the red-eye from San Francisco, marveled at the transformation of their Tatterstamalian Grammy. But where had her hair gone to? What? Said the stiffened Grace again. But Gustave's sister forebode to elaborate, just as she had failed to mention that Gustave's first wife, who had died last January in Rouen, had divorced him decades ago, influenced by a French pharmacist she'd fallen in love with. Gustave and Grace honeymooned in Paris, indulging themselves mightily. A hotel with a courtyard, starred restaurants, a day in Giverny, another in Versailles. They even attended a lecture on the new uses of benzene. Gustave, interested in the subject. Grace, with little French and less science, interested in the somber crowd assembled at the Pasteur Institute. They both loved the new promenade and the new musée, and they sat in Sainte-Chapelle for 2 hours, listening to a concert performed on old instruments, 2 recorders and a lute and a viola da gamba. That was the most blissful afternoon. Gustave put the disarray of their hotel room out of his mind, and also the sometimes fatiguing jubilation with which Grace greeted each new venture. Grace dismissed her own irritation of Gustave's habit of worrying about every dish on the menu. Did it matter how much cream? How much butter? We all had to die of something. Light streamed through the radiant window, turning into gold his trim mustache, her untidy chignon. And now it was September and classes had begun. Gustave taught physics for poets on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The uses of chemistry, those same days at 10. He taught a graduate seminar in the philosophy of silence on Thursday evenings. The first 2 weeks, the seminar met in the usual drafty classroom, but then Grace suggested, and Gustave demurred. She persisted. He surrendered. And so, on the 3rd week, the seminar met in the brown shingled house. Grace baked 2 apple tarts and served them with warm currant jelly. The students relived last Saturday's football game. Gustave, who like Grace professed a hatred of football, quietly allowed the conversation to continue until everyone had finished the treat, then turned the talk to Archimedes. Grace sat in a corner of the living room knitting. The next day marked their first separation since the wedding. Gustave had a conference in Chicago. He'd taken a cab to the airport right after the uses of chemistry. Early that morning, he'd packed necessary clothing in one half of his briefcase. While he was reading the newspaper, she slipped in a wedge of apple tart wrapped in tinfoil. After they kissed at the doorway, his eye wandered to the corner she had occupied on the previous evening. The chair was still strewn with knitting books and balls of yarn, and the garment she was working on. No doubt a sweater for him. She'd already made him a gray one. This wool was rose. His gaze returned to his smiling wife. "See you on Sunday," he said. "Oh, I'll miss you." She did miss him immediately. She would have continued to miss him if she had not been invaded half an hour later by two old Northampton friends bearing Hal Karsh. Hal was visiting from his current perch in Barcelona. He would return to Spain on Sunday. Hal, master of the broken villanelle, inventor of the 13-line sonnet, and oh, that poetic hair brushing his eyebrows, hair still mostly brown, though he was only 8 years younger than Grace. Those long fingers adept at pen and piano, but not at keyboard. The word processor was death to composition, he'd tell you, and tell you why, too, at length, anywhere, even in bed. Gustave's upright piano could have used a tuning. Grace had meant to call someone, but she had been too busy putting in chrysanthemums and ordering bulbs and trying to revive her high school French. The foursome made music anyway. Lee and Lee, the couple who brought Hal, had brought their fiddles too. Grace rummaged in a box of stuff not yet unpacked and found her recorder. Later she brewed chili. They raided Gustave's cave. They finally fell into bed, Lee and Lee in the spare room, Hal on the floor in Gustave's study, Grace, still dressed, on the marital bed. Then on Saturday they drove to Walden Pond and to the North Shore, and on Saturday night Cambridge friends came across the river. This time Grace made minestrone in a different pan. The crock encrusted with chilies still rested on the counter. Hal wondered what Grace was doing in a gloomy house in a town that allowed no overnight parking. Such a regulation indicated a punitive atmosphere, and this husband so abruptly acquired, who was he anyway? She picked him up in a zoo in front of a lynx, Lee and Lee told him. He hoped they were exercising their artistic habit of distortion. Hal loved Grace with the love of an indulged younger brother or a ragtag colleague. Years ago, he and she had taught at the same experimental grade school, the one that demanded dedication from its faculty but didn't care about degrees. Hal did have a master's, but Grace had neglected to go to college. Hal thought Grace was looking beautiful, but unsettled. Did her new spouse share her taste for illicit substances? Did he know of her occasional need to decamp without warning? I mean, she always came back. When Hal had mentioned that the Cambridge folks would bring grass, Grace's eyes danced. Well, nowadays it was less easy to get here. In Barcelona, you could pick it up at your tobacconist, though sometimes the stuff was filthy. But this batch was fine. They all talked as they smoked and recited poetry, and after a while played charades. It was like the old times, he thought. He wished Henrietta had come along too. I have no use for that fuss budget she married, Henrietta had snapped. But the fuss budget was in Chicago. It was like the old times, Grace, too, was thinking, and how clever they all were at the game, how particularly clever in this round, Lee and Lee standing naked back to back while she, fully clothed, traversed the living room floor on her belly. Odd that no one had yet guessed New Deal. Odd, too, that no one was talking, though a few moments earlier there had been such merry laughter. And Hal, that man of parts, had put two of his fingers into his mouth and whistled. At Lee? Or at Lee? In silence, Grace slithered toward the hall and saw, at eye level, a pair of polished shoes. Pressed trousers rose above the shoes. She raised her head as an eel never could, because she now resembled a worm ruining the tableau. The belt around the trousers was Gustave's. Yes, she had given it to him. It had a copper buckle resembling a sunburst, within which bulged an oval turquoise. When it was hanging from his belt rack among lengths of black and brown leather with discreet matching buckles, the thing looked like a deity, lord of the closet. Now, above dark pants, below striped shirt, it looked like a sartorial era, a misalliance. Scrambling to her feet, she found herself staring at Gustave's shirt. Where was his jacket? Oh, the night was warm. He must have taken it off before silently entering the house 15 hours before he was expected. Her gaze slid sideways. Yes, he had placed, not thrown, his jacket on the hall chair. He had placed, not dropped, his briefcase next to that chair. She looked again at her husband. His exposed shirt bore a large stain in a rough triangular shape, the shape, she divined, of a wedge of tart. She touched it with a trembling forefinger. That tender little gift of yours, it leaked, he said. He surveyed his living room. That naked couple had attended his wedding, had drunk his champagne, a pair of know-it-alls. Their names rhymed. The other creature he had never seen before, a skinny fellow with graying bangs, advanced toward him. Gustave, I want you to meet, Grace began. Ask these people to leave, he said in a growl she had never heard before. They seeped away like spilled pudding, Lee and Lee first, dressed in each other's clothing, clutching their overnight cases and instruments, kissing Hal on the rush toward their car and its overnight parking tickets. They didn't kiss Grace. The Cambridge crowd didn't kiss anybody. But Hal, he stood his ground. He was a head taller than Gustave. He extended a hand. I'm goodbye. Listen here. Get out. He got out with his satchel in his left hand and in the curve of his right arm, Grace. At the last minute, she turned as if to look at Gustave, to plead with him, maybe, but it was only to snatch up her pocketbook from the hall table. Next to the pocketbook, she saw a cone of flowers, sweet peas, baby's breath, and a single Gerber. An unimaginative bouquet. He must have picked it up, ready-made at the airport stall. Gustave climbed the stairs. The guests had apparently cavorted mostly on the first floor, except for the 2 unmade beds in the spare room. The only sign of their occupation were towels, like puddles, on the bathroom tiles. He went into his study, and his eye flew to the bookcase where, in a manuscript, between thick bindings, stood his biography of Faraday, still in search of a publisher. No one had stolen it. On the carpet lay a book, open face down. He leaned over and identified it as a Spanish grammar. He kicked it. Downstairs again, he heated some minestrone. He had not eaten anything since his abrupt decision to abandon that boring conference and come home early. The soup was tasty. He looked for a joint. How sweet the house still smelled. But the crowd had apparently sucked their whole stash. He did find in one corner a recorder, but he couldn't smoke that. He put all the plates and glasses into the dishwasher. He tried to scrub the remains of chili from a pot, then left it to soak. He vacuumed. Then he went upstairs again and undressed. And leaving his clothes on the floor, ooh, these gypsy ways were catching, slipped into Grace's side of the bed. With a sigh, he recognized as an old man's. He flopped onto his back. His thoughts, which were uncharitable, did not keep him from falling asleep. But a few hours later, he found himself awake. He got up and went through the house again. He threw the Spanish grammar into the trash bag he had stuffed earlier and lugged the thing out to the garage, knowing that anyone who saw him in his striped pajamas under the floodlight of 3 o'clock in the morning would take him for a madman. So what? Their neighbors considered them a cute couple. He had overheard that demeaning epithet in the fish market. He'd rather be crazy than cute. He relocked the garage and returned to the house. And surely he had been deranged to marry a woman because of her alluring eyes. He'd mistaken a frolicsome manner for lasting charm. She was merely frivolous. And the minute she was left unsupervised, he stomped into the living room. That rose-colored garment in progress now shared its chair with a wine bottle. Good vineyard, good year. Empty. He'd like to rip the knitting out. The yarn would remain whorled. He'd wind it loosely into one big whirl. When she came back, she'd find a replica of Faraday's induction coil, pink. Come back? Well, she could come back to collect her clothing and her paella pan and the bulbs she kept meaning to plant. He picked up the sweater. It would fit a 10-year-old. Insulting color, insulting size. He went back to bed and lay there. Grace, too, was awake. The hotel room was dark and malodorous. Hal slept at her side without stirring, without snoring. He had always been a devoted sleeper. He was devoted to whatever brought him pleasure. Under no circumstances would she accompany him to Barcelona, as he had idly suggested last night. He had also suggested that she buy the drinks at the hotel bar downstairs. She supposed she'd have to pay for the room, too. Anyway, she had left her passport next to Gustave's in his top drawer. She'd hoped he'd send it back to her in Northampton. She had not yet sold her house there, thank goodness. Thank Providence. Thank whoever was in charge. She'd hoped He'd send all her things without obsessive comment. She wanted no more of him. She wanted no more of Hal either. I mean, it was enough that she had shared his toothbrush last night and then his bed and was now sleeping, well, failing to sleep, in one of his unlaundered shirts. How hideous to have only yesterday's lingerie. Unshaved underarms were one thing, grotty underpants quite another. What time did stores open on Sundays? She'd slip out and shop, get a new sweater maybe. That would pick her up. She remembered the half-finished vest for her granddaughter she'd left on the chair. She hoped Gustave would send that back too. "Amelie," muttered Hal. "Grace," she corrected. If only she were back in Northampton already, where everyone was needy, and she was needed. She wished that she had never visited that wild animal preserve at the Cape, but never paused to look at those foxes. She wished she had not married a man because he was learned and polite, especially since he had turned out to be pedantic and sanctimonious. From time to time that Sunday, Gustave thought of calling the lawyer who married them. She happened to specialize in divorce. Instead, he read the papers and watched the football game. What a sport. Force directed by intelligence. He prepared for tomorrow's class, the one in which he and students would reproduce one of Faraday's earliest experiments in electrification. They'd all come carrying foil-wrapped, water-filled film canisters with a protruding nail. These were primitive Leyden jars in which to store electricity. The electricity would be produced by a styrofoam dinner plate nested in an aluminum pie pan. The kids would bring these friction makers too. He went to bed early. He could see a new autumnal moon above the mansard across the street. Well, only the upper half of the sphere was visible. But he could supply the rest. Grace bought, among other things, a yellow sweater. She took her time getting back to the hotel. She found Hal showered and smiling. During a long walk by the river, she listened to his opinions on magic realism. She'd forgotten what that was, she admitted. The use of an epithet instead of a proper name, Hal said. The fuss budget, say. He told her of the Spanish medieval farsa, which was related to farce, and just when she thought her aching head would explode, it was time to put him in a cab to the airport. He seemed to have enough cash for the taxi. He thrust his head out of the open window as the vehicle left the curb. My apartment is near La Ramblas. Best location in Barcelona, he called. She waved. The cab disappeared, and her headache with it. She went back to their room, not hers, and read the papers and enjoyed a solitary supper in front of the TV, watching a replay of that afternoon's football game. Nice intercept. Such brave boys there on the screen. But Gustave had been brave too, hadn't he? Scorning savoir-faire as he cleansed his house of unwelcome revelers. How red his face had become when Hal theatrically held out his hand. He'd felt wrong, hadn't he? Or perhaps in the wrong. Maybe he thought she'd summoned her friends. Maybe he thought he'd failed her. If she ever saw him again, she'd tell him about Hal's lonely rootlessness. She'd tell him about poor Lee and Lee's barn of unsellable paintings. If she ever saw him again. She put on her new nightgown and went to bed. She could see the curve of the dome of the Massachusetts State House, just enough to suggest the whole. The lecture room was shaped like a triangle. The platform, holding lectern and lab bench, was at the apex, the lowest part of the room. Concentric rows of slightly curved tables radiated upward toward the back. 3 students sat at each table. The professor stood at the lectern when he talked, moved to his lab bench for demonstrating. He and the students employed their identical homemade equipment. As he talked and demonstrated, creating the electric charge, storing it, the students imitated. There was expectant laughter and an occasional excited remark and a general air of satisfaction. Only a few of these poets might change course and become physicists, but not one of them would hold science in contempt. Faraday made this experiment with equally crude apparatus, he reminded them, and with faith that it would work. Faith, so unfashionable now, was his mainstay. The woman in the back row, alone at a table, without pie plate or film can, wished that she too had the implements, that she could obey the instructions of the measured, kindly voice. But mostly she marveled again at the story that voice was telling of the humble young Faraday, setting himself upon his life's journey. He considered that God's presence was revealed in nature's design, wound up the little man. He looked radiant. When he at last noticed the figure in the yellow sweater, he was cast back to an afternoon in Paris when that same glowing color had been produced by sun refracted through stained glass, and the lips of his companion had parted as she listened to winds and strings and music aloft. She had thrilled. She had become elevated. She had generously carried him with her. The lecture concluded to applause. The teenagers dispersed. The professor materialized in the chair next to the visitor. They looked at each other for a while. "I'm Grace," she said at last. "I'm Gustave." And how his heart leaped. "I'd like to get to know you." Another long pause while he belatedly considered the dangers in so ambitious an enterprise. For he, too, would have to be known, and his shabby secrets revealed, and his out-of-date convictions as well. They'd endure necessary disappointments, and they'd practice necessary forgivenesses, careful to note which subjects left the other fraught. Grace's mind moved along the same lines. Each elected to take the risk. Gustave showed his willingness by touching the lovely face. Grace hers by disdaining eclipses. "Me too," was all she said. So Grace and Gustave decide to give their marriage another chance. My next poem celebrates a long and worthy marriage. Here is Anne Bradstreet's "To My Dear and Loving Husband." If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the East doth hold. My love is such that rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then, while we live in love, let's so preserve, then when we live no more, we may live ere. My final story was written by H.G. Wells in 1925. He claims it to be one of his favorites. Whereas our first story presents the risks of falling in love, this next story presents a love that ends too soon. It is about love, loss, grief, devotion, and obsession. And the listener must consider the meaning of the story as it runs its course. Here is The Pearl of Love. The pearl is lovelier than the most brilliant of crystalline stones, the moralist declares, because it is made through the suffering of a living creature. About that, I can say nothing because I feel none of the fascination of pearls. Their cloudy luster moves me not at all, nor can I decide for myself upon that age-long dispute whether the pearl of love is the cruelest of stories or only a gracious fable of the immortality of beauty. Both the story and the controversy will be familiar to students of medieval Persian prose. The story is a short one, though the commentary upon it is a respectable part of the literature of that period. They have treated it as a poetic invention, and they have treated it as an allegory, meaning this, that, or the other thing. Theologians have had their copious ways with it, dealing with it particularly as concerning the restoration of the body after death. And it has been greatly used as a parable by those who write about aesthetics. And many have held it to be the statement of a fact, simply and boldly true. The story is laid in northern India, which is the most fruitful soil for sublime love stories of all the lands in the world. It was in a country of sunshine and lakes and rich forests and hills and fertile valleys, and far away the great mountains hung in the sky, peaks, crests, ridges of inaccessible and eternal snow. There was a young prince, lord of all the land, and he found a maiden of indescribable beauty and delightfulness, and he made her his queen and laid his heart at her feet. Love was theirs, full of joys and sweetness, full of hope, exquisite, brave, and marvelous love, beyond anything you have ever dreamed of love. It was theirs for a year and part of a year, and then suddenly, because of some venomous sting that came to her in a thicket, she died. She died, and for a while the prince was utterly prostrated. He was silent and motionless with grief. They feared he might kill himself, and he had neither sons nor brothers to succeed him. For 2 days and nights he lay upon his face, fasting across the foot of the couch, which bore her calm and lovely body. Then he arose and ate, and went about very quietly, like one who has taken a great resolution. He caused her body to be put in a coffin of lead mixed with silver. And for that, he had an outer coffin made of the most precious and scented woods wrought with gold. And about that, there was to be a sarcophagus of alabaster, inlaid with precious stones. And while these things were being done, he spent his time, for the most part, by the pools and in the garden houses and pavilions and groves, and in those chambers in the palace, where they two had been the most together, brooding upon her loveliness. He did not rend his garments, nor defile himself with ashes and sackcloth, as the custom was, for his love was too great for such extravagances. At last he came forth again among his counselors and before the people, and told them what he had a mind to do. He said he could never more touch woman. He could never more think of them. And so he would find a seemly youth to adopt for his heir and train him to his task, and that he would do his princely duties as became him, but that for the rest of it he would give himself with all his power and all his strength and all his wealth, all that he could command, to make a monument worthy of his incomparable, dear, lost mistress. A building it should be of perfect grace and beauty, more marvelous than any other building had ever been or could ever be, so that to the end of time it should be a wonder, and men would treasure it and speak of it and desire to see it, and come from all lands of the earth to visit and recall the name and memory of his queen. And this building, he said, was to be called the Pearl of Love. And this his counselors and people permitted him to do. And so he did. Year followed year, and all the years he devoted himself to building and adorning the Pearl of Love. A great foundation was hewn out of the living rock in a place whence once seemed to be looking at the snowy wilderness of the great mountains across the valley of the world. Villages and hills there were, a winding river, and very far away 3 great cities. Here they put the sarcophagus of the alabaster beneath a pavilion of cunning workmanship, and about it there were set pillars of strange and lovely stone, and wrought and fretted walls, and a great casket of masonry bearing a dome, and pinnacles and cupolas as exquisite as a jewel. At first, the design of Pearl of Love was less bold and subtle than it became later. At first it was smaller and more wrought and encrusted. There were many pierced screens and delicate clusters of rosy-hued pillars, and the sarcophagus lay like a child that sleeps among flowers. The first dome was covered with green tiles, framed and held together by silver. But this was taken away again because it seemed close, because it did not soar grandly enough for the broadening imagination of the prince. For by this time he was no longer the graceful youth who had loved the girl queen. He was now a man, grave and intent, wholly set upon the building of the Pearl of Love. With every year of effort, he had learnt new possibilities in arch and wall and buttress. He had acquired greater power over the material he had to use, and he had learnt of 100 stones and hues and effects that he could never have thought of in the beginning. His sense of color had grown finer and colder, He cared no more for the enameled gold-lined brightness that had pleased him first, the brightness of an illuminated missal. He sought now for blue coloring like the sky, and for the subtle hues of great distances, for shadows and sudden broad floods of purple opalescence, and for grandeur and space. He wearied altogether of carvings and pictures and inlaid ornamentation and all the little careful work of men. Those were pretty things, he said of his earlier decorations, and had them put aside into subordinate buildings where they would not hamper his main design. Greater and greater grew his artistry. With awe and amazement, people saw the pearl of love sweeping up from its first beginnings to a superhuman breadth and height and magnificence. They did not know clearly what they had expected, but never had they expected so sublime a thing as this. Wonderful are the miracles, they whispered, that love can do, and all the women in the world, whatever other loves they had, loved the prince for the splendor of his devotion. Through the middle of the building ran a great aisle, a vista that the prince came to care for more and more. From the inner entrance of the building he looked along the length of an immense pillared gallery and across the central area from which the rose-hued columns had long since vanished, over the top the pavilion under which lay the sarcophagus, through a marvelously designed opening to the snowy wilderness of the great mountain, the lord of all mountains, 200 miles away. The pillars and arches and buttresses and galleries soared and floated on either side, perfect yet unobtrusive, like great archangels waiting in the shadows about the presence of God. When men saw that austere beauty for the first time, they were exalted, and then they shivered and their hearts bowed down. Very often would the prince come to stand there and look at that vista, deeply moved and not yet fully satisfied. The pearl of love had still something for him to do, he felt, before his task was done. Always he would order some little alteration to be made or some recent alteration to be put back again. And one day he said that the sarcophagus would be clearer and simpler without the pavilion. And after regarding it very steadfastly for a long time, he had the pavilion dismantled and removed. The next day he came and said nothing. And the next day, and the next. Then for 2 days, he stayed away altogether. Then he returned, bringing with him an architect and 2 master craftsmen and a small retinue. All looked, standing together, silently in a little group, amidst the serene vastness of their achievement. No trace of toil remained in its perfection. It was as if God of nature's beauty had taken over their offspring to himself. Only one thing there was to mar the absolute harmony. There was a certain disproportion about the sarcophagus. It had never been enlarged, and indeed, how could it have been enlarged since the early days? It challenged the eye. It nicked the streaming lines. In that sarcophagus was the casket of lead and silver, and in the casket of lead and silver was the queen, the dear, immortal cause of all this beauty. But now that sarcophagus seemed no more than a little dark oblong that laid incongruously in the great vista of the pearl of love. It was as if someone had dropped a small valise upon the crystal sea of heaven. Long the prince mused, but no one knew the thoughts that passed through his mind. At last he spoke. He pointed. "Take that thing away," he said. I've reached the end of my reading for today. As always, thanks for listening. This is your reader, Caroline. Bye for now.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have some history articles from our friends at the IAAIS. And then at 2 o'clock, we have episode number 33 of Mark Twain by Ron Chernow. And at 3 o'clock, we have Smithsonian Magazine. Stay with us for these readings and more.
This program is intended for a print-impaired audience and is brought to you by Mind's Eye.
Well, it is the week of February 2nd. Welcome. This is the History segment. I'm your reader, Dave Miller. Appreciate you being here. We are going to move from the book Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which we have spent really the last 2 weeks going over instead of articles. We're going to go back to our traditional path, and we're going to go through the topics of what happened this day in previous years. Then we're going to jump into the January Smithsonian for a time where New Yorkers tried to secede from the Union. We've got a bipolar view of Standard Oil and the Rockefellers. I kind of teased to you actually a month ago in an article entitled Back to the Future about Artemis II moon mission. We've also got Life and Trials of Samuel Green regarding the Underground Railroad. We've got several articles about the Palmer immigration raids, the snowball that was the shot heard round the world, and an interesting quick view into how the U.S. has really grown and shrunk over the years. So much, much, much more than we can cover, probably even in 2 weeks. But we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started. So what happened on February 2nd, 1461? It was the War of the Roses. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross was fought in Hertfordshire, England. 1653. New Amsterdam. Okay. What city is that? New Amsterdam. Yep, you guessed it. It is later renamed as the City of New York, but it was incorporated in 1653. 1887, Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. The first Groundhog Day is observed. And by the way, this year we have 6 more weeks of winter. Too bad. Good thing is he's only accurate 35% of the time. So there. 1913, Grand Central Terminal is open in New York City. Been there. Love it. It's beautiful. 1922, Ulysses by James Joyce is published. 1925, the Serum Run to Nome. Dog sleds reach Nome, Alaska with diphtheria serum, inspiring the Iditarod race. 1934, the Export-Import Bank of the United States is incorporated. 1935, Leonard Keeler tests the first polygraph machine. 1972, the British Embassy in Dublin is destroyed in protest at Bloody Sunday. Yep, Sunday, Bloody Sunday. 1974, the F-16 Fighting Falcon flies for the first time. 1976, Groundhog Day gale hits the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. 1982, Hama massacre. Syria attacks the town of Hama. 1989, Soviet war in Afghanistan. The last Soviet armored column leaves Kabul. 2004, Swiss tennis player Roger Federer becomes number 1 ranked men's single player, a position he would hold for a record 237 weeks. Jumping to February 3rd, 1488, Bartolomeu Dias of Portugal lands in Mosel Bay after rounding the Cape of Good Hope, becoming the first known European to travel so far south. 1787, Shays' Rebellion is crushed. 1834, Wake Forest University is established. 1913, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified, authorizing the federal government to impose and collect income tax. Yes, it is that time of year again, folks. 1947, the lowest temperature in North America is recorded in Snag, Yukon. 1995, astronaut Eileen Collin becomes the first woman to pilot the space shuttle as mission STS-63 gets underway from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We're going to talk about the Artemis mission a little bit later on. 1998, Carla Faye Tucker is executed in Texas, becoming the first woman executed in the United States since 1984. 2007, a Baghdad market bombing kills at least 135 people and injures a further 339. 2008, the New York Giants defeated the heavily favored and previously undefeated 18-0 New England Patriots in Super Bowl XLII, yes, 17-14 in what is known as one of the greatest upsets in sports history. February 4th, 960. The coronation of Zhao Qingyun as Emperor of Song, initiating the Song Dynasty period of China that would last more than 3 centuries. 1801, John Marshall sworn in as Chief Justice of the United States. 1825, the Ohio legislature authorized the construction of the Ohio and Erie Canal and the Miami and Erie Canal. 1846, the first Mormon pioneers make their exodus from Nauvoo, Illinois, westwards towards the Utah Territory. I've been to Nauvoo. It's really an interesting and moving place to go visit and read about. 1859, the Codex Sinaiticus is discovered in Egypt. 1861, American Civil War. In Montgomery, Alabama, delegates from 6 breakaway U.S. states meet and form the Confederate States of America. 1899, Philippine-American War begins. 1969, Yasser Arafat takes over as chairman of the PLO. 1974, Symbionese Liberation Army kidnaps Patty Hearst in Berkeley, California. 1977, Chicago Transit Authority elevated train rear-ends another, derails, killing 11, injuring 180. It's the worst accident in the agency's history. 1992, coup d'etat, led by Hugo Chavez against Venezuelan President Carlos André Perez. Started this whole thing that we just are working on now. 2002, Cancer Research UK, the world's largest independent cancer research charity, is founded. 2003, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia is officially renamed to Serbia and Montenegro and adopts a new constitution. 2004, Facebook, mainstream online social network, is founded by Mark Zuckerberg. 2010, the Federal Court of Australia's ruling in Roadshaw Films versus 2Net sets a precedent that internet service providers, ISPs, are not responsible for what their users do with the services the ISP provides them. How do you feel about that? What happened on February 5th? 62. Earthquake in Pompeii, Italy. 1778, South Carolina becomes the first state to ratify the Articles of Confederation. 1869, the largest gold nugget in history, called the Welcome Stranger, is found in Mauleagool, Victoria, Australia. I probably mispronounced that. 1917, the Congress of the United States passes the Immigration Act of 1973 over President Woodrow Wilson's veto. Also known as the Asiatic Barred Zone, it forbade immigration from nearly all of South and Southeast Asia. 1918, the SS Tuscania is torpedoed off of the coast of Ireland. It is the first ship carrying American troops to Europe to be torpedoed and sunk. 1919, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith launched United Artists. 1924, the Royal Greenwich Observatory begins broadcasting the hourly time signals known as the Greenwich Time Signal, or the BBC Pips. Still remember radio that at the top of the hour you'd hear this ding. 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt proposes a plan to enlarge the Supreme Court of the United States. Today we call that Supreme Court packing. 1939, Generalissimo Francisco Franco becomes the 68th or leader of Spain. 1963, the European Court of Justice ruling in Van Gend and Loos versus, and I'm going to translate it, Netherlands Administration of Belastinghen establishes the principle of direct effect, one of the most important, if not the most important, decisions in the development of European Union law. 1963, direct effect. 1971, astronauts land on the moon on the Apollo 14 mission. 2009, the United States Navy guided missile cruiser USS Port Royal runs aground off of Oahu, Hawaii, damaged the ship as well as a coral reef. February 6th, looking back, 1649, the claimant, King Charles II of England and Scotland, is declared King of Great Britain by the Parliament of Scotland. This move was not followed by the Parliament of England nor the Parliament of Ireland. So, in effect, what actually happened was the King of England and Scotland was actually only the King of Scotland, and that's all that ever happened for him. 1778, American Revolutionary War in Paris, the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce are signed by the United States and France, signaling official recognition of the new republic. 1788, Massachusetts becomes the sixth state to ratify the U.S. Constitution. 1815, New Jersey grants the first American railroad charter to John Stevens. 1819, Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles founded Singapore. 1843, the first minstrel show in the United States, the Virginia Minstrels, opens in the Bowery Amphitheater in New York City. I don't think I've ever seen a minstrel show. 1862, the American Civil War. The U.S. Navy gives the Union its first victory of the war, capturing Fort Henry in the Battle of Fort Henry. 1918, British women over the age of 30 get the right to vote. 1933, the 20th Amendment to the United States Constitution establishing the beginning and ending of terms of elected federal offices goes into effect. 1934, far-right leagues rally in front of the Palais Bourbon in an attempt coup against the French Third Republic, creating a political crisis in France. 1951, the Broker, a Pennsylvania Railroad passenger train, derails near Woodbridge Township, New Jersey. The accident kills 85 people and injures 500 more. The wreck is one of the worst rail disasters in American history. 1978, the blizzard of 1978. One of the worst nor'easters in New England region hit the region with sustained winds of 65 miles an hour and snowfall of 4 inches an hour. Kind of reminds you of what happened in the Carolinas over the weekend. 1989, the roundtable talks start in Poland, thus marking the beginning of the overthrow of communism in Eastern Europe. 1996, the Willamette Valley flood of 96. Floods in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, United States, causes the U.S. $500 million property damage throughout the Pacific Northwest. February 7, 457, Leo I becomes the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. 1497, the Bonfire of the Vanities occurs, in which supporters of Girolamo Savonarola burn thousands of objects like cosmetics, art, books in Florence, Italy. 1812, the strongest in a series of earthquakes strikes New Madrid, Missouri. We had a small quake a couple of weeks ago. I didn't feel it. Wonder if you did. 1894, the Cripple Creek miners' strike led by the Western Federation of Miners begins in Cripple Creek, Colorado. 1935, classic board game Monopoly is invented. 1984, Space Shuttle Program STS-41B. Astronauts Bruce McCandless and Robert Stewart make the first untethered spacewalk using the Manned Maneuvering Unit, MMU. Talk about faith. 1986, 28 years of one-family rule ended in Haiti when President Jean-Claude Duvalier flees the Caribbean nation. 1990, dissolution of Soviet Union. The Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party agrees to give up its monopoly on power. 1999, Crown Prince Abdullah becomes King of Jordan on the death of his father, King Hussein. February 8th, Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, rebels against Queen Elizabeth I, and the revolt is quickly crushed. 1837, Richard Johnson becomes the first Vice President of the United States chosen by the U.S. Senate. 1879, the England cricket team led by Lord Harris is attacked during a riot during a match in Sydney. 1904, Battle of Port Arthur. A surprise torpedo attack by the Japanese at Port Arthur, China, starts the Russo-Japanese War. 1910, the Boy Scouts of America is incorporated by William D. Boyce. 1915, D.W. Griffith's controversial film, The Birth of the Nation, premieres in Los Angeles. 1946, the first portion of a revised standard version of the Bible, the first serious challenge to the popularity of the authorized King James Version, is published. 1946. 1948, the formal creation of Korean People's Army of North Korea is announced. 1965. After taking evasive maneuvers to avoid a mid-air collision immediately after takeoff from JFK, Eastern Airlines Flight 663 crashes into the Atlantic Ocean, explodes, and kills everyone on board. 1968, American Civil Rights Movement, the Orangeburg Massacre, an attack on black students from South Carolina State University who were protesting racial segregation at the town's only bowling alley, leaves, and according to this, 3 or 4 dead in Orangeburg, South Carolina. So, I don't know about you, but that one little segment there, I kind of didn't like the idea of the history segment saying that 3 or 4 people were killed. That seemed rather odd. So I did a little work. Turns out that 3 young men were shot and killed. 28 people were wounded that night, and it was one of the most violent episodes in civil rights history. Apparently there was a bowling alley owner, Harry Floyd. He claimed his bowling alley was exempt from segregation laws because it was private property, and the black community determined to change it. They had students come out from South Carolina State and Claflin University, and they tried to convince him to integrate his bowling alley. He refused, and the protest began. It was peaceful, but then the next night, a large crowd returned. They were met with police, and that's when everything escalated. So, moving forward, 1971, South Vietnamese ground troops launch an incursion into Laos to try and cut off Ho Chi Minh Trail, stop communist infiltration. 1983, Melbourne dust storm hits Australia's second largest city, the result of the worst drought on record in a day of severe weather conditions. A 320-meter deep dust cloud that's 1,000 feet envelops the city, turning day into night. 1993, General Motors sues NBC after Dateline NBC allegedly rigs 2 crashes intended to demonstrate that some GM pickups can easily catch fire if hit in certain places. NBC settled the lawsuit the next day. 2001, Disney California Adventure Park opens it to the public as part of Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California. Been there. It's a cool place. That ends our very long segment today on what happened this day in history. Let's go ahead and jump into the articles. The one I had talked about a few weeks ago before we got started on Thomas Paine and Common Sense was this kind of two-dimensional view of the Rockefellers. Rockefeller family is one of the wealthiest families in American history, right? They're considered greatly influential in business, art, architecture, and philanthropy. But capitalism was a little bit different back in those days. And there was actually another view of the Rockefellers that was published, a lady named Ida Tarbell. And we're going to go through both. So John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in a relatively modest circumstance. He became the world's first billionaire in 1916 after creating the first major business trust. By some accounts, he is still the richest man to have ever lived. Today, the Rockefeller family has a cumulative net worth of $10.3 billion. Their modern-day influence mostly involves charitable giving to causes like higher education, the environment, and national parks. John Rockefeller was not born into wealth. He sold candy as a child to support his family and later worked as a bookkeeper. With his savings and a loan from his con artist father, John opened the first business in 1859. Roughly a decade later, he created Standard Oil Company of Ohio with his brother, William A. Rockefeller, Jr. The brothers had taken note of the boom in oil emerging in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, supercharged by new drilling technology and the discovery of the underground reserves. The Rockefeller brothers made some savvy moves that transformed Standard Oil into a family business, or from a family business into an American dynasty. They chose to focus on refining instead of exploration or drilling, as an example. This created a more stable business, exposed them to less volatility. They also chose to vertically integrate, bringing much of the work in-house as possible instead of relying on other businesses. John and William led the company through a research and development, oil byproduct sales, and a huge expansion. The brothers gobbled up competitive refineries, and by 1880, their Standard Oil Trust controlled 90% of all oil refineries in the U.S. At its peak, the business was worth at least $1 trillion. The Standard Oil monopoly. The Standard Oil business eventually came to define monopolistic business practices in the U.S., and they ushered in new regulations. Purchasing competitor refineries led to massive growth for Standard Oil, leading the company to eventually dominate the American oil refining business. However, accounts from the famous business journalist Ida Tarbell highlight the darker side of the Rockefeller success. J.D. Rockefeller was, quote, a robber baron, unquote, who earned his money via cutthroat business practices, Tarbell argued. Small refineries, she said, basically no choice but to let the Rockefellers acquire them off it at unfairly low prices. Those who pushed back found themselves bankrupt as Standard Oil undercut them. In 1890, with the intent of blocking monopolistic companies like Standard Oil, the Supreme Court found that Standard Oil, in violation of the legislation in 1911, it forced the businesses to split up. The Sherman Act is still the foundation of antitrust litigation today. General Electric, AT&T, American Tobacco, and Microsoft are just a few of the many companies that have faced Supreme Court cases as a result of the Sherman Act. After 1911, Standard Oil split into 34 companies. Some of those offshoots became powerful oil businesses themselves, living on today as Chevron and ExxonMobil. Through multiple generations and billions of dollars, the Rockefeller family has left its mark on the U.S., financing everything from New York's Rockefeller Center to the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg. It's amazing. I've been there. It's just crazy how much money went into that place. The Museum of Modern Art, been there, and the University of Chicago. So ends on a positive note. But I wanted to do a little deeper dive into Ida Tarbell. I went to Wikipedia. It was the best article that I could find that was short, concise, but gave enough depth of detail. So she wrote a book, The History of Standard Oil Company, 1904. It is an expose about the Standard Oil Company, run at the time by oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, the richest figure in American history. Originally serialized in 19 parts in McClure's magazine, the book is a seminal example of muckraking, M-U-C-K, R-A-K-I-N-G, and inspired many other journalists to write about trusts, large businesses that, in the absence of strong antitrust laws in the 19th century, attempted to gain monopolies in various industries. The history of Standard Oil Company is credited with hastening the breakups of Standard Oil, which came about in 1911 when the Supreme Court of the United States found the company to be violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. The subsequent decision splintered the company into 34 baby standards. The value of Rockefeller shares rose after the breakup as the new companies had positive development on the stock exchange. The original book has 2-volume hardcover set. An abridged paperback edition was later released. The context is that the book was largely fueled by Ida Tarbell's childhood experiences. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, worked for Standard Oil and lived through what Ida called hate, suspicion, and fear that engulfed the community, end quote. As a direct witness to the schemes and horizontal integration of John D. Rockefeller and his associates, Tarbell began building the foundations of the history of Standard Oil Company early with growing senses of interest and discontent. After her education and cumulative writing experience, Tarbell began working at McClure's Magazine, where she wrote several successful series on historical figures. After this initial success, her shift turned to John D. Rockefeller. She began by interviewing Henry H. Rogers, one of her father's fellow independents who became one of Rockefeller's colleagues, as well as others close to the inner workings of Standard Oil. It included founders Frank Barstow as well. Eventually, Tarbell uncovered a crucial piece of evidence proving that Standard Oil was rigging railroad prices and preying on its competition. Public outcry erupted at the conclusion of Tarbell's 19-part exposure of Standard Oil published in McClure's, eventually resulting in the expedited breakup of Standard Oil in 1911. Journalists, politicians, and citizens alike celebrated the accomplishments of Tarbell, a woman outside the inner workings of business without significant money or influence. These reactions are immortalized in political cartoons utilizing imagery of Rockefeller's hidden agendas being demolished by investigative journalism and muckraking. Several journal and newspaper reviewers address the history of Standard Oil Company by praising its calmness in the face of hatred, focus on facts, genuine exposure of the effects that greed can have on businessmen seeking success. A 1904 editorial review from the New York Times relayed the highlights of the volumes to the public, noting the diplomatic tendencies of Tarbell within her work. Still widely respectful of the achievements of John D. Rockefeller, but critical of Standard Oil business strategies that were unfair and of questionable legality. One review from the Economic Journal fixated on the monumental nature of Tarbell's work, stating that it is difficult to write about Miss Tarbell's remarkable achievement without using language approaching the edge of hyperbole. So careful is she in her facts, so sane in her judgments, that she seems to have reached the high water mark of industrial history. Though Standard Oil accrued more cumulative value after it was broken up, the exposure of what Tarbell described as immoral and illegal business became a striking symbol of the power of the press. As such, the history of Standard Oil Company harbors great significance as a standard bearer of modern investigative journalism. In 1999, a jury under the aegis of the New York University's journalism department selected the book as the 5th best work of journalism in the United States in the 20th century. In 2008, the book Taking on the Trust, the epic battle of Ida Tarbell and John D. Rockefeller, Steve Weinberg, described the exposure of Standard Oil as arguably the greatest work of investigative journalism ever written. In a 2010 column, libertarian conservative economist Thomas Sowell criticized Tarbell for what he characterized as cherry-picking which data to include in her book. Quote, one of the crucial facts left out of Ida Tarbell's book was that Rockefeller's improvement in the oil industry brought down the price of oil to a fraction of what it had been before. Would the public have been better off if older and more costly methods of producing, processing, and shipping oil had been continued to be used, leading to prices far higher than necessary? End of quote, question mark. Good point. So, several different views on the same topic. I thought you might get a kick out of learning about the whole history there and doing a little bit deeper dive into it. Hope you enjoyed that. So, a little bit of background here. Some of these articles I will cut and paste from sources like History.com, 1440, Wikipedia, you name it. Others, I will go to the actual magazines, and I think I mentioned Civil War Monitor and Smithsonian, and I will actually, we've got a subscription. I'll just read straight from them. I think they're very interesting. So in this case, I cut and pasted a number of articles. There's several of them from History.com over the last couple weeks. So they are in this document that I use. It's a Word document, and I kind of keep it and update it every week. So the next topic on this document were what were the Palmer raids and what tactics did they use. So I think I'm going to break sequence, and instead of going to the Smithsonian, I think I'm just going to continue reading these articles. So a little background on my process. This article, the prelim is, after World War I, federal agents detained more than 10,000 immigrants suspected of being anarchists and communists. It was published January 22nd, 2026 by Dave Roos, and again, History.com. He starts the article, in 1919 and 1920, during the height of the first Red Scare, federal agents and police arrested thousands of people in dozens of American cities suspected of being anarchists, radicals, and communist sympathizers. The raids, ordered by Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, targeted foreign-born Americans, especially Russians, who were dragged out of homes and meeting houses, beaten by police, and held without bail in cruel detention centers. The Palmer raids initially had broad public support during an anxious time in U.S. history, when the anarchist bombings, labor strikes, and the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution had American politicians and newspapers warning of a communist takeover. After World War I, there was growing anxiety in the United States about radical political groups that were opposing capitalism and published anarchist manifestos. These fears were deepened by anti-immigrant hostilities directed at the Italians, Russians, Catholics, and Jews. Many prominent leftists, like the anarchist revolutionary Emma Goldman, were Jewish, and some were the most militant anarchists were Italian Americans. On June 2, 1919, a bomb exploded in front of Attorney General Palmer's home in Washington, D.C. That same night, 8 other bombs detonated at the homes of judges, politicians, law enforcement officers. No one was killed except for the man who bombed Palmer's house, a militant anarchist named Carlo Valendonci. Quote, when anarchists set off these bombs, it was taken as proof that a revolution was taking place in America, says Christian Finan, author of From the Palmer Raids to the Patriot Act. It seemed to confirm everybody's worst fears, and there was a lot of pressure in the government to do something about it. Palmer recounted standing in the wreckage of his bombed-out library while senators and other congressmen called upon me in strong terms to exercise all the powers that was possible to the Department of Justice to run to earth the criminals who were behind this kind of outrage. The Immigration Act of 1918 authorized the U.S. Justice Department to arrest any alien advocating the violent overthrow of the U.S. government or belonging to a group affiliated with anarchists. The same law also gave the Department of Labor the power to deport foreign-born agitators. Palmer put an ambitious young justice lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover in charge of gathering intelligence on individuals and groups that could be subjected to deportation under the 1918 Act. Palmer launched his first major raid on November 7, 1919, the 2-year anniversary of the Bolsheviks seizing power in Russia. In more than a dozen U.S. cities, federal officers and local police stormed the offices and meeting houses of the Union of Russian Workers, an anarchist labor organization that also served as a community center of sorts for Russian immigrants. At the Russian People House in New York City, armed federal agents burst into an algebra class attended by adults and teenagers. Officers ordered the teacher to remove his glasses, then beat him severely and threw him down a flight of stairs. As the Russian students were driven from the classrooms, officers struck them with pieces of a wooden banister ripped from the staircase. Federal agents ransacked the meeting house looking for bomb-making materials or evidence of terrorist plots. They fell on the Russian people's house and just tore it apart, says Finan. It wasn't an orderly process of arresting individuals. They took everybody, threw them in the vans, and then they destroyed the place. The violent raids were repeated across the country. In Hartford, Connecticut, members of the Russian Union workers had gathered for a meeting about purchasing a car when federal agents broke down the doors. The men were held at the notorious Semmes Street prison in Hartford, where they slept on bare iron bunks without mattresses or blankets. When visitors came to check on the prisoners' safety, they were also arrested. In total, 97 men were kept in near solitary confinement at Semmes Street lockup for 5 months. Some were held in the prison's so-called punishment rooms, located directly above the boiler room where the floors were hot enough to burn a prisoner's feet. The men had no contact with lawyers and received a glass of water and a slice of bread every 12 hours. Palmer and the Justice Department claimed the November 7th sweep netted thousands of violent anarchists, but only a small fraction of the people arrested and detained were actually convicted of the crime and deported. It's estimated that 75% of the people caught up in the first raid were released without charges, but some, like the Semmes Street prisoners, only after lengthy and torturous detentions. Palmer was emboldened by the first raid, which celebrated in the press and led to the arrest of Emma Goldman, an unapologetic anarchist and a free speech activist. Goldman was born in Russia, but she lived nearly her entire life in the United States. On December 21, 1919, Goldman and 248 others were loaded onto the U.S. Buford, nicknamed the Soviet Ark by the press, and deported. The first Palmer raid was very popular, says Finan. There was real fear over this new threat. The Bolsheviks had just taken power in this bloody revolution, and it was easy to associate radicals in America with radicals in Russia. The second Palmer raid on January 2nd, 1920 was even more ambitious. The targets were allegedly members of the Communist Party or the Communist Labor Party, but agents randomly raided any organization and group that had a Russian-sounding name or contained the word socialist. For the most part, there were no arrest warrants, says Finan. They just identified places where radicals were thought to meet and arrested everybody they found. In a single day, an estimated 10,000 people were rounded up in more than 30 American cities and towns. That included Russian couples dancing at the Tolstoy Club in Manchester, New Hampshire, people eating dinner at the Tolstoy Vegetarian Restaurant in Chicago, and the members of the Lithuanian Socialist Chorus in Philadelphia were seized in the middle of rehearsal. As with the first Palmer raid, detainees from the January 2nd sweep were denied basic civil liberties and due process. They were given little food, locked in unheated cells without bedding or toilets, and interrogated without legal representation. The mistreatment of detainees during the Palmer raids led directly to the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. The Palmer raids resulted in 6,400 deportation cases prepared by the Justice Department. But under the Immigration Act of 1918, the Justice Department wasn't in charge of deportations. That was the Labor Department's job. Acting Labor Secretary Louis Post was a sharp critic of Palmer's methods. Post canceled thousands of warrantless arrests and nullified 70% of the deportation orders. In the end, 556 people were deported as a result of the Palmer raids. But Palmer wasn't done. The Attorney General planned to run for president in 1920, and the raids had garnered some popular support. Palmer doubled down on his anti-Russian rhetoric and claimed the Bolshevik revolutionary cells in America were planning a major uprising on May Day, May 1, 1920, including more than a score of assassination attempts against government officials. When the May Day attack failed to materialize, Palmer's political aspirations dried up. In 1921, Palmer expressed no remorse about the raids when he testified before a Senate committee. Quote, "I apologize for nothing the Department of Justice has done," said Palmer. Quote, "I glory in it. I point with pride and enthusiasm to the results of the work. And if the agents of the Department of Labor were a little rough or unkind with these alien agitators, I think it might well be overlooked in general good to the country." End of quote. End of article. Next article. Annette McDermott wrote on June 26, 2018, on a cold night in Boston in 1770, angry colonists pelted a lone British sentry with snowballs, and the rest is history. The title of the article is, "Did a Snowball Start the American Revolution?" I think we've touched on this in a couple different articles over the years, but thought read a dedicated article. On the night of March 5th, 1770, the streets of Boston, Massachusetts were coated with snow, and the tension was thick between angry colonists and British soldiers who occupied their town. As British Private Hugh White stood guard near the Custom House on King Street around 8 o'clock, he was approached by a small group of frustrated young male colonists. Reports vary as to exactly what happened, but insults and taunts were exchanged and a physical confrontation ensued. Church bells rang out and incensed colonists flooded the streets. Then someone pelted White with a snowball. More snowballs, ice, and oyster shells soon followed. As the violence and threats escalated, White called for backup. Was the snowball the actual shot heard around the world that started the American Revolution? Plenty had come before to fuel this skirmish before any innocent snowball fight. Americans living in 13 colonies had grown increasingly disgruntled with British rule during the 1760s. From 1763 to 67, British Parliament passed a series of laws such as the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Act, which imposes taxes and trade restrictions on everyday goods in the American colonies. They also passed the Currency Act, which prevented colonies from making new paper money and keeping them reliant on British currency. The colonists were furious, especially since they had no elected representation in Parliament. Over the next few years, leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, George Washington, and Samuel Adams spoke out against Britain's increasingly tight grip on their daily lives. Britain eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but then issued the Declaratory Act, which gave them complete power over legislation in the colonies. That set the stage for the Revolution. By March 5th, 1770, angry colonists in Boston were itching to confront British soldiers who were occupying their town and were quartered in their homes, their inns, and their businesses. They had endured years of British rule and became increasingly rebellious. As Private Hugh White was pelted that snowy night in Boston, help arrived in the form of Captain Thomas Preston and several of his men. By this time, some of the colonists' weapons of choice had changed from snowballs to clubs and sticks. According to Preston's written account of the event, one soldier was struck in the head with a stick and fired his gun. As more snowballs and other projectiles flew and clubs were wielded, other redcoats fired on the mob, killing 5 colonists and wounding 6 more. By the time the first shots were fired at the massacre, British regulars and Bostonians viewed each other with suspicion and contempt, said Tony E. Carlson, associate professor at the School of Advanced Military Studies. Boston Massacre led to an open revolt. Revolutions don't just involve guns and armies and militias. They're fought with words, protests, boycotts, and yes, even snowballs. It can be argued that American colonists began a revolution against Britain long before the snowballs flew at the Boston Massacre. According to Carlson, it might be a stretch to assert that a snowball launched from the American Revolution, but there is little doubt that the Crown treated Massachusetts as the epicenter of the revolutionary sentiment following the colonial outbursts of anger. The impressment of sailors on British ships, competition over limited jobs, and the enforcements of custom duty fueled the bad blood that ultimately resulted in the loss of life at King Street and catapulted Massachusetts towards open rebellion. End of quote, end of article. So let's go back to the Smithsonian January-February 2026 issue. Under the heading of Statecraft, there's an article called Losing the Big Apple, how clashing cultures spurred New York City to secede, almost. A divisive presidential election threatened to destroy the Union. It was 1860, and Abraham Lincoln, on record as being morally opposed to the enslavement of human beings, had swept nearly every county in the Northeast and Upper Midwest and lost every single one south of the Mason-Dixon line. He'd lost in every county in and around New York City, fracturing the nation's largest state. The city's mayor, Fernando Wood, decided to act. Wood could see the Union was coming to an end. Expecting the breakup to be peaceful, he wanted his metropolis to seek its independence as well, ending an unhappy 2-century-long marriage between the Dutch-founded city and the New England settlement upstate New York. Rival cultures had never seen eye to eye, with other portions of our state having unfortunately been imbued with the fanatical spirit which accentuates a portion of the people of New England. The city of New York has an unfaltering preserved the integrity of its principles and adherence to the compromises of the Constitution, he would later say. The real danger to the city, he added, wasn't the Confederacy, but the hostile upstate lawmakers in Albany. Before November of 1860 was out, Wood was holding private secession planning meetings at his sprawling country estate on what is now Upper West Side, with invitations going out to real estate tycoon William Astor, financier August Belmont, and Democratic Party honcho Samuel Tilden. Financier George Law, one of Wood's most powerful allies, was dispatched to Washington to rally the city's congressional delegation to support the plan. While worried officials in Albany tasked Metropolitan Police Superintendent John Kennedy with gathering intelligence on the mayor's plans, reporters at newspapers opposed to the mayor began receiving leaks that Wood might lead the city out of the Union. On December 10th, it was all out in the open. On that day, pro-secession Congressman Daniel Sickles delivered a fiery speech on the U.S. House floor. Secession, although it may begin at the South, will not end at the South, he told his colleagues. There is no sympathy now between the city and the state of New York, nor has there been for years. When the Union is no more, we will not consent to remain the submissive appendage of Puritan province, Sickles added. I tell you, our imperial city will repel the hateful cabal at Albany, which has so long abused its power over her, and as a free city, open wide her gates to the civilization and commerce of the world. James Buchanan, the lame duck president, was alarmed, writing a friend that no adequate cause exists for the extent and violence of the existing panic in New York. Through that momentous winter, as the Deep South seceded, the Confederate States of America was created and Lincoln was inaugurated. It seemed as Wood's succession plan might work. Many in the metropolis hoped it would. Merchants feared staying with the Union meant losing the city's lucrative southern trade. But the most urgent concern was that the greater New York City, the polyglot, multi-ethnic, commercially minded, raucous, tolerant society founded by the Dutch, would be trapped in a state and rump federation dominated by Yankees of Puritan New England origin, with their moralistic missions, assimilative predilections, and growing hostility to drinking, Catholicism, and slavery. Had the South Carolinians not fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, New York City might well become its own country, a Singapore-like city-state on the Hudson. New York has always been a state divided between two colonial area cultures whose people have looked askance at one another since the 17th century. The towns and cities on Manhattan, western Long Island, the Hudson Shore, New Jersey, and in the lowermost Hudson Valley were the legacy of New Netherland colony, with Dutch names scattered from Haarlem to Brooklyn to Hoboken. For decades after its 1624 foundation, the colony was run by a global corporation, the Dutch West Indies Company, and served as an entrepot between Virginia, New England, and the Iroquois Confederacy. From where it started was diverse, populated by French-speaking Walloons, Scandinavians, Lutherans, Irish, Portuguese Catholics, and Sephardic Jews, Anglican and Quaker English, free and enslaved Africans, and at least one Muslim farmer from Morocco. The Dutch were rarely in majority, even as their signature architecture, steep gabled roofs crowned with red tile, defined New Amsterdam, the settlement at the tip of Manhattan Island. Their government promoted trade and eschewed democracy while tolerating cultural differences, religious dissenters, freedom of inquiry, and human bondage. At a time when social status was largely a matter of birth, New Netherlands' local elite were self-made men. The first Vanderbilt was an indentured servant. The founder of Van Cortlandt dynasty was a soldier, and the Van Burens started as tenant farmers. After an English victory in Dutch in 1664, New Netherland became New York, but Greater New York City, including New Jersey, western Long Island, and lower Hudson counties, remained culturally Dutch, and the language was dominant there for another century. By 1861, the city had become what Old Amsterdam had been 2 centuries earlier, a cosmopolitan center of banking, publishing, and trade, a haven for people persecuted in neighboring politics. Upstate New York, by contrast, had been settled by New Englanders. Hundreds had moved south to infiltrate the contested intercolonial border before 1664, and afterwards the numbers alarmed the Dutch, who had long dismissed their provincial northern neighbors as Jan Kaas, a derogatory epithet that was essentially a Dutch version of cheesehead, which sounded like Yankees to the English. These upstate Yankee colonists were descendants of early Puritans who believed they had been chosen by God to create a more perfect society in New England wilderness. Unlike the Dutch, 17th century New Englanders were decidedly monocultural, obsessively moralistic, and notoriously intolerant, hanging Quakers, attacking Indians, and driving out dissenters. By the early 19th centuries, the Puritan Yankee descendants had become convinced their mission was to consummate the ideals in the Declaration of Independence. By the antebellum period, the New England founded settlements across the northern 7/8 of New York State weren't just part of Greater New England, they had become the primary stronghold of its Masonic social projects. This was the burned-over district center of utopian religious awakening that produced Mormonism, Seventh-day Adventism, and the free-love Oneida community. The women's suffrage movement started in Seneca Falls, and some paths of the Underground Railroad terminated on the shores of Lake Erie. The leaders of these rival cultural zones, the anything-goes Dutch space and the moralistic, orderly Yankee one, did not see eye to eye on either slavery or multiculturalism. Tensions only increased as a large number of Irish, German, and other foreign immigrants arrived in the city. And the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which forced citizens of free states to participate in capturing enslaved people seeking freedom, stirred abolitionist sentiment in the rest of the state. New York City and its mayor, tolerant of slavery and diversity alike, aligned with the Southern-dominated Democratic Party. Upstate New York, which had then more people, joined Lincoln's new anti-slavery Republican Party while taking measures to bring the unruly metropolis to heel. In 1857, the upstate Yankees used their legislative majorities and governorship to severely restrict when and where and by whom liquor could be sold in the state, while taking over control of the city's metropolitan police, transport and major public works projects. In response, Mayor Wood created his own rival police force, which released suspects arrested by the Metropolitans. When latter arrived to arrest Wood himself for inciting a riot, Wood's men engaged them in a violent battle on the steps of City Hall. Wood and his allies therefore saw the impending collapse of the Union as an opportunity. They knew there was no appetite for open rebellion. New Yorkers' beef was with the state, not the federal government, and they put their hopes in peaceful dissolution. If the Confederacy is broken up, the government is dissolved, and it behooves every distinct community as well as every individual to take care of themselves, Wood explained. On January 7, 1861, the mayor made his move. He told city aldermen that New York City would proclaim its independence. Writing in reference to the New England colonized upstate, Wood asks, "Why may not New York dispute the bands that bind her to a corrupt and venal master?" Instead, he argued the city would form its own city-state, pointing to examples such as Hamburg, Frankfurt, Bremen, and other Hanseatic states in what would later become Germany. Amid the gloom which the present and prospective condition of things must cast over the country, New York City as a free city may shed the only light and hope for future reconstruction of the nation, he declared. Southerners loved the mayor's proposal, with Virginian writer George Fitzhugh lauding it as a chance to escape the immoral, infidel, agrarian, free-love democracy of Western New York and the rule of Puritans, the vilest, most selfish, and unprincipled of the human race. At least 3 members of the city's congressional delegation were there for it. 3 daily newspapers, the Express, Daybook, and Daily News, were enthusiastic, as many merchants and bankers. Secession by peaceful and legal means, the Daily News editorialized, is worthy of the attention of every New Yorker. But Southern Carolina's shocking April 12th attack at Fort Sumner, a federal military base protecting Charleston's harbor, incensed most everyone living north of the Mason-Dixon line, effectively ending the city's move for independence. Popular opinion in New York City swung behind Lincoln's call for troops to put down the rebels. Wood directed citizens to set aside partisanship and rally to the restoration of the Constitution and the Union. Sickles raised 4 regiments of soldiers and, as Major General at Gettysburg, lost a leg, earned the Medal of Honor for fighting the Confederates. Okay, we will continue this article written by Colin Woodard in the Smithsonian, which I think is really interesting, and in light of today's thoughts and politics of values, shows just such a wide variety back in New York in the day. I think it's a great article for us to go through. I'll continue the last page next week. You take care. Have a great week.
Coming up next on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have episode number 33 of Mark Twain by Ron Chernow. At 3 o'clock, we have Smithsonian Magazine. And at 4 o'clock, we have an episode of With Good Reason entitled The Grandmothers. Tune in to find out what that means. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,